This is a story about a camera, a conveyor, and a conclusion. The camera belonged to men who served a government that believed wars were won by nerves of steel and speed of movement. The conveyor belonged to a factory that believed wars were won by repeatable work done the same way every hour of every day. When the lens met the line, the point of the war shifted. The images that passed through glass onto emulsion were ordinary pictures of girders and gantries, of women at rivet guns and men in denim jackets leaning into fixtures. Yet those frames added up to something that made strategy look small. The plant was Ford's Willow Run, an airframe city raised in farm country to turn aluminum and sheet steel into B-24 Liberator bombers. The Spies were German, trained to read strength in the curves of wings and the geometry of a jig. What they saw forced an admission that no staff officer enjoys. Courage would not be enough. Capacity, disciplined by process, would decide. To understand why this mattered, fix the terms. German spies, in this context, means the quiet network that grew from the Abwehr and from industrial attachés, technical observers, and sympathizers who traced production footprints wherever American rail lines and highways brought goods and workers into a handful of giant plants. Their goal was not to film secrets of a new weapon so much as to measure a slope. How fast the United States could turn money and manpower into flying machines. Captured footage means strips of film and still photographs gathered by small cameras that read the outside of a system, boxes coming in, fuselages crossing a road on trestles, final assemblies rolling toward a flight line combined with patient note-taking and routine eavesdropping in diner booths near shift change. And Ford's plant means Willow Run specifically, the outsized complex that married automotive flow to aeronautical precision. It was never the only bomber plant in America. It did not always meet its boldest press releases, but it was the plant whose very existence answered the German question, could the Americans make the air war inexhaustible? Scale is the first hard fact. A factory is not only square footage, it is the distance between repeated tasks, the number of times a part can be clamped without a specialist's hand, the frequency with which material and information meet at the same station. Willow Run dealt in such arithmetic. The camera did not care about speeches. It recorded pallets replenished on schedule, overhead hoists that made heavy parts obedient, workstations that looked alike from one end to the other. The lens taught the most important lesson in industrial war, that genius, in this idiom, was not a single brilliant engineer, but the institutional patience required to make the 100th fuselage fit like the first. The men who risked the film were not naive about factories. Germany had its own manufacturers with proud lineages and formidable shops. The Reich could make marvels. Engines that sang at altitude, optics that saw further than the eye, airframes that climbed with a hawk's grace. But the camera at Willow Run kept returning the same awkward truth. Precision in small runs could not outrun method in large runs if the war lasted long enough. A day's worth of movement through the American plant contained more standardized acts than a week's worth of improvisation elsewhere. It was not that the United States produced better workers, it produced interchangeable tasks. Watch one frame closely. The conveyor never hurries and never rests. Carriages pace the day in steady increments. Each station offers the same language of fixtures, locating pins, stops, jacks, and gauges that forgive the novice and discipline the expert. You see, people learn at speed because the task has been designed to make learning safe. A hand meets a tool that locks into one correct position. The torque is set, the angle is defined, the material arrives already kitted. Training, therefore, is not a haze of craft. It is an introduction to a choreography the floor will not allow you to forget. The spies did not need access to the tool crib to understand this. They could read it in how quickly a new face on the line fell into the rhythm, in how seldom the supervisor left a mark on a clipboard, in how a stoppage solved itself when a replacement station took the slack. Readers of war histories often want words like audacity and thunder. Those words belong to air crews who rode these machines into weather and fire. This story is about other words: tact time, gauge repeatability, process capability. They take longer to thrill. They make wars end sooner. The footage of Willow Run showed a factory that had turned heroism into statistics. No one wanted to say it that way, but the line did not mind the truth. A bomber becomes a template becomes a promise becomes a number per day. The number per day becomes a slow kind of certainty that eats at an enemy's calculations. A campaign conceived as a contest of ideas and maneuvers becomes, gradually and then suddenly, a contest of replenishment. At the start of their work, the German observers had hoped to find a boast out of proportion with reality. Newspapers talked about a bomber an hour, and about the carman's magic transforming aircraft construction into something quick and simple. The men behind the cameras knew magic was a lie, and quick was not simple. They expected to watch a fever break, a plant missing parts, an assembly improvised, blame shifting between office and floor. They did not get the scene they came for. What they received was more frightening than magic. They found schedule in place of charisma. They found layout in place of speech. They found that the will to build had been embedded in fixtures rather than pep talks, which meant it could be multiplied by hiring and training instead of genius. The truth of the film was not always flattering to the place that made it. Big systems have waste. You can spot buffers that look too generous, crates that wait, rework stations catching errors that should have been prevented upstream. The point is not that Willow Run was perfect. The point is that it taught its own improvements every day, because feedback travelled in visible ways. A queue got longer, a station blinked a light, a supervisor took 10 steps more than yesterday. A system that exposes its errors to the eye is a system that can be made better by ordinary people. There was no way to film that honesty and not understand its power. Years later, it became fashionable to ask whether it was factories or fighters that won the war. That is a false choice built by tidy narratives. People win wars, but they win them by giving their efforts the best possible leverage. The camera at Willow Run captured leverage. It saw a society decide to write its courage into fixtures, gauges, kitting lists, piped-in parts, and clocked movements. It recorded a place where managers took responsibility for the work by designing it so that the worker could succeed on the first day. The footage forced an unwelcome conclusion on its takers. An enemy that turns valor into process will not run out of valor because it no longer spends it recklessly. The only honest response to that kind of enemy, if you cannot match its capacity, is to shorten the war quickly or watch your plans dissolve in the steady passage of an overhead line. Hold that image as the foundation of everything that follows. A camera blinks, a carriage moves, the hour turns, another airframe inches into daylight. The men with the film do not need a guide to interpret it. The sequence interprets itself. It promises more of itself tomorrow. Before the camera ever found the line, time had been spent building the path the line would take. The tale begins in the uneasy months, when a nation not yet at war tried to imagine how it would make the tools for a war that felt far away. Specifications hardened into contracts. Farmland turned into a surveyor's chessboard. Steel arrived by the trainload. A factory of unusual size demanded unusual decisions. Walls could not go up without rail spurs. Rail spurs could not be useful without roads that flared into broad mouths for trucks. Roads would not suffice without towns of temporary houses and mess halls and clinics for the flood of people who would follow the promise of steady work. The start of the clock is not a single date on a cornerstone. It is an accumulation of commitments that no politician can easily reverse once the concrete is ordered. What matters to an observer who cares about output is the order in which problems vanish. A plant with a roof and no cranes cannot lift its ambition. A plant with cranes and no standardized stations will lift one fuselage impressively and then stall. A plant with stations but no scheduling discipline will sprint for a week, collapse under its own variety, and rewrite every chart in the office. Willow Run's first months were a parade of these near misses and sudden fixes, a set of knots tied tight by teams who never needed their names in the newspaper. The clock's tick through that period is visible in how the plant learned to remove uncertainty from each day. Schedules that once begged for miracles learned to make do with sufficiency. Ambitions that once chased headlines learned to chase repeatability. In factories, humility is not timidity. It is a decision to trust the calendar. The footage the Germans managed to secure begins, in the narrative sense, after those knots had been tied. But understanding the sequence means reading the prologue. Once the line flowed at all, it discovered its character. The early airframes were fussy and reluctant, full of discoveries too late to be elegant. Assemblies sat waiting for mates that did not arrive on time. Parts fought against jigs that should have anticipated their tendencies. Production is theatre with fewer costumes and more physics. The first rehearsal always looks like a mess. The critical moment is not when the first show opens. It is when the director forbids improvisation and insists that the second show be the same as the first, only better. That discipline is the moral centre of mass production, and it is the point at which an opponent ought to be most afraid. The clock for the Spies, however, had its own milestones. They identified recruiting patterns for the workforce and surmised shift changes by the pulse of buses. They logged the trains that came at night and counted the empties that left at dawn. They measured the pause between a fuselage's first visible move and its appearance at the airfield fence. They began to annotate the rhythm of meals. The point was not romance, it was calibration. Once you can predict a beat, you can predict the song. Their notes, even if they were never granted a tour of the floor, became a timepiece wound by strangers. That timepiece ran against a strategic clock of a different scale. In the air over Europe, losses were real and relentless. Machines fell to flak and fighters, to weather and chance, to fatigue and the stubborn mathematics of attrition that do not care about gallantry. Commands that planned campaigns on paper had to fight the erosion that every morning's briefings inflicted on their strength. The question the Spies were sent to answer was whether that erosion could be reversed faster than it occurred. It is an unglamorous question. It matters more than most. If the plant's calendar outpaced the enemy's attrition, then the air war would not sag under its own gravity. If it failed, then every bold plan would swim against a current it could not beat for long. Dates accumulated. There was the day the line first moved with no stoppage for an entire shift. The day the second line mirrored the first closely enough that a worker could switch sides without confusion. The day rework stations sat idle for an hour because upstream quality had held. The day a test pilot made 2 acceptance flights in one afternoon because the dispatchers had learned how to feed him. Factories create their own holidays that no one celebrates, all of them milestones of banal triumph. Calendars pinned on corkboards told the story more cleanly than memos ever could. Instead of tall waves of output followed by troughs, the scribbles straightened into a band that thickened. Consistency is the kind of heroism that leaves no statues and wins wars anyway. The observers did not need to be told any of this by insiders. The movement of finished craft toward the airfield gave them the only metric that mattered. If on Tuesday 3 airframes crawled past the fence, and on Thursday 4 did, and the pattern repeated the following week, then the question ceased to be whether this was a lucky spell. The question became how far the method would run. Factories, like armies, exhaust themselves when planning outruns logistics. What the footage suggested maddeningly to the men who wished it were not true was that logistics had been built first, and planning was riding on top of it like a steady passenger. Doubt lasted longer than one might think, because propaganda existed on both sides of the ocean. Headlines loved round numbers and audacious goals. Executives loved to talk in bright phrases about miracles. The counter-narrative whispered that you could fool a camera, that the day captured on film was the exception, that somewhere around the corner a warehouse of unfilled parts was dragging the cadence down. The only cure for doubt is time. Over weeks and months, the same scenes repeated in new coats. Snow on the fence rather than autumn leaves, rain puddles shining under wheel trucks instead of dust. A new crew clustered at a station that used to stall. Repetition is a cold truth-teller. It teaches the watcher to believe. It taught the watchers at Willow Run that the line was learning to keep its promises. When the clock reaches the point where parts do not surprise the schedule, leadership learns a new way to speak. Desperation drains from voices in briefing rooms. Plans lengthen. A command that expects its losses to be replaced is a different creature than a command that prays for miracles. The people who made decisions in Berlin were not fools. They had built their own wonders, and they had watched other factories fail to keep easy promises. But the film's implicit calendar suggested that America had done something simple and therefore formidable. It had convinced time to work for it. Each hour that passed did not thin the line of hope. It thickened the line of output. It is difficult to overstate how unpleasant that realization feels to the mind that must report it. There is no way to dress it in brave adjectives. The grammar of capacity is plain. You say that this many units will be completed by this date because these many stations exist, and these many hours will pass, and these many hands will turn the same fasteners in the same order. You do not add exclamation points. You do not mention inspiration. You admit that the opponent has taken the chaos of war and pressed it into a schedule. The clock that started in survey stakes and footings now ran on oil and habit. The men with the film understood that their masters would not like the news. They also knew that the news would be worse if it were couched in euphemisms. The camera had no patience for those. Thus the clock started, and once started, it did not give back any of the days it had gained. A war is a confusion of many races against weather, against fear, against the enemy's imagination. The race that counted most in this story was against the calendar. The plant began to win that race the day the second shift saw nothing remarkable in the fact that its work looked exactly like the first shift's and produced the same number of airframes as a matter of course. That is when the film ceased to be a curiosity and became a verdict. The time it recorded could not be turned back. There is a temptation to treat a famous factory as a legend, to speak of it in broad strokes and loud numbers. The truth presents itself more quietly when you stand near the loading docks or walk along a mezzanine and listen to how a place breathes. Willow Run breathed in railcars and exhaled aircraft. The lung capacity of that building comes into focus when you follow a single carload of aluminum from the yard to the press to the line. You count the minutes more important than the miles that separate raw metal from a shaped skin panel ready to be riveted to a rib. Time, in such a plant, is the only currency that matters, and every fixture is an investment designed to buy time back. Imagine entering at dawn when the fog still hangs over the fields. The plant is not a single hall so much as an ecosystem of halls connected by arteries. Overhead, conveyors move assemblies with a patience that looks like grace. Floor-level tugs pull carts stacked with pre-kitted parts. There is no romance in the bins, just the rough logic of a grocery list arranged to be found by muscle memory. Workers arrive in clusters that the supervisors no longer have to shepherd. The routine has slipped into everyone's bones. This, more than any square-foot statistic, is the plant at a glance, a place that no longer thinks about how to start the day. Follow the line long enough and the variety of tasks collapses into repetition. A skeptic might see monotony. An engineer sees proof that defects will not recruit allies. When each station confronts a narrow range of work and is fed the same set of parts in the same order at the same intervals, the station's errors have nowhere to hide. Quality people do not have to search for drama. They watch for deviations from a heartbeat. The heartbeat is the takt, the planned pace that decides how long a station owns a piece of the airplane before passing it to the next pair of hands. If you stand with a stopwatch, the pace explains itself even to the uninitiated. A bell sounds. Lights shift, hoists hum. The work moves because the clock demands it. This is not cruelty. It is the architecture of fairness in an industrial setting. No station is asked to sprint. None is allowed to dawdle. All are protected by buffers that keep small misfortunes from becoming stoppages. Numbers reveal themselves everywhere if you develop the habit of asking simple questions. How many rivet guns sound within hearing distance? How many torque checks happen between the fitting of a spar and the closure of a wing? How many times does a kit cart empty and refill in a shift? The plant has answers that do not change because consistency is the point. The rail spurs tell their own tale in axles per day, the cafeterias in trays per hour, the washrooms in minutes per break per head. People who have never worked in a factory sometimes mock such metrics as petty, but petty metrics are the morality of a place built to produce weapons without wasting lives or materials. Every minute saved is a minute the line can use to reduce strain on the crews who will fly what it makes. The geography of Willow Run was not subtle. Vast spans of roof hid trusses like the bones of a whale. Beneath them, stations repeated like measures in a long song. The air hung with the metal scent of cutting fluid and the warm smell of insulation. If you paused, your eye would catch organization more than scale. Signs that call out parts by simple names. Shadow boards that show where a tool belongs. Lines on the floor that tell tugs where to go. Chalk marks that record checks in a language any new worker can learn in an hour. The elegance of such cues lies in how little they require from genius. They reward care and put a flaw under competence. Where a craft shop would rely on the memory of a handful of masters, this plant relied on collectively maintained memory stored in labels, fixtures, guides, and procedures. Memory, externalized, can be scaled. People, not machinery, remained the first cause of motion, and the workforce itself was a fact as important as any square footage figure. The plant learned to welcome those who had never touched an airplane before. It did this not by lowering standards, but by refusing to make standards mysterious. Training lines existed that taught a novice the difference between snug and tight, between good and perfect, between perfect and wasteful. The language of the place was deliberately plain. Supervisors who thrived spoke in verbs. Lift, align, clamp, drill, deburr, fasten, check, sign. Their sentences ended in a number when one would do. You could hear the culture of the building in how little it asked you to pretend. Anyone who has faced a dangerous machine knows how comforting it is when a teacher eschews flourish and deals in steps. One level above the line, planners and schedulers lived with charts that showed kits by station and day. They learned to trust those charts only after the shop proved it could resist the urge to chase exceptions. The fastest way to ruin a flow line is to start believing that your true job is heroics. Managers who have finally tasted consistency will not relinquish it. They do not cut corners to squeeze out a headline number. They smooth corners to remove stress from the hours. The plant's public numbers, how many aircraft rolled out in a month, how many shifts ran without stoppage, were the shadows of private, quieter victories. A station that went a week without needing rework. A logistics route that went a month without a missed delivery. A training class that sent every graduate straight to value, adding work with no remediation. If you had no camera and wished to steal the plant's soul, you would stand near the receiving bays and count the parts that arrived already prepared for the line. In a mature system, the line does not cope. Others cope for it. Sub-assemblies arrive as promises. You will not have to figure me out. You will simply place me where I belong and move on. That promise is the soundest way to guard against fatigue, because fatigue feeds on friction. The most humane thing a factory can do is to make each hour predict itself. This is not complacency, it is mercy. The mercy propagates outward to the crews who will trust the product, because predictability in production becomes predictability in maintenance, and predictability in the way a machine behaves when pushed. The Spies film could not see everything. It could not record the arguments in conference rooms where a foreman refused to accept a bad fixture, or where a buyer told a supplier that lateness would break the heart of a schedule. But the film did not need those scenes. Enough of the plant's character was visible at a glance to build a model in the mind. You begin with the shape of the building and the cadence of the line. You add the behavior of the workers and the ease with which a novice finds their place. You overlay the trains and trucks. You watch finished aircraft migrating toward the field. When that model runs without constant intervention, you have your answer. The place is not a legend. It is a system. Systems are harder to break than legends. There is a last glance that tells more than any statistic. Near sunset, when the shift changes and the parking lots slowly trade places, the building pauses but never sleeps. Lights dim in one aisle and brighten in another. A lone hoist glides overhead carrying a subassembly that will meet its mates in the morning. A janitor's cart squeaks. A safety inspector kneels to chalk a mark around a tiny leak so it will be noticed at startup. The ritual is ordinary. Its ordinariness is the loudest claim the plant makes. This place, it says, does not depend on a particular mood or a particular person. It depends on mornings that resemble yesterday and tomorrows that keep their appointments. That is the glance that lingers, because you recognize at once how difficult it is to build such a mood, and how unstoppable it becomes once built. It is the glance that convinces even a hostile witness that defeat is not a sudden event. It is a long slope you slide down while your opponent adds one more airplane to a patient line. They did not cross oceans, cultivate sources, and hazard cameras for romance. They came to measure practicality. Strategy consumes inputs. A nation that can deliver inputs on a schedule begins to bend the shape of campaigns. The task set before the German observers was simple to state and merciless to answer. Could the United States sustain air power at a tempo that would make German adaptation meaningless? Sustaining is dull to talk about. It is agony to fight against. The intent of the mission, therefore, was to replace rumor and bravado with a number, and then to take that number back to desks where men who loved decisive moves would learn to think in months. The first object of interest was throughput. It sounds childish, but the question, how many, how often, is the only one that matters after a certain threshold of quality has been reached. If the plant could hold a cadence beyond a single parade of publicity, then all the complaints about American crudity and reliance on quantity would become self-indictments. The observers sought to catch the cadence, because cadence eats courage. They watched entrances and exits, not speeches. They counted crates and listened to the traffic on the road that led past the airfield. They wanted to know whether the flow could be interrupted, and if interrupted, how quickly it would heal. A flow that heals itself is worth more than brilliance that cannot be replicated. The second object was substitution. A system that depends on a few experts will choke when a man falls ill or a train derails. A system that tolerates the replacement of people and parts without drama is one that will erase your sabotage with a shrug. The point of watching so many stations was to see if the tasks had been stripped of idiosyncrasy. A rivet is a simple thing. The act of setting it without damaging the skin is not simple. If a line can teach that act in hours and enforce it by fixture and gauge, then it has replaced fragility with pattern. The spies aimed to detect pattern in the very places where craft once ruled. Whenever they saw a new hire mimic an old hand without sweat, they wrote a small, private note that the system had learned to survive its own growth. The third object was timing across the river of parts. Airframes are only the end of a long chain of bores and threads, of seals and linkages, of instruments and fuel cells. An enemy might hope to attack any one of those streams and watch the whole delta go dry. But if a plant sits inside a logistics network that can shunt around blockages, then even successful interdiction will feel like throwing rocks at water. The observer's intent included mapping not just the building but its feeders. Which rail yards most often received the heavy cars, which roads bore the steady burden of aluminum and alloy, which subcontractors' crates appeared in greatest number near the stations that traditionally bottlenecked a build. These were not romantic errands. They were the work of men who knew that a bomber is something like a sentence written by many hands. If you can predict where the nouns come from and how often the verbs arrive, you can judge whether the paragraph will be finished in time. There was also an object of morale that has little to do with speeches and much to do with how a workday feels. Factories with brittle schedules sound different. They are tense and full of sprints. Supervisors bark, and barked orders echo. Workers learn to hide problems and to refuse help because help is punishment. Factories with mature schedules hum. They have minutes to spare in the places they need them. They solve awkward fits at the station designed to catch them rather than 5 stations downstream. You can hear whether a place is improvising or executing. The observers, for all their attention to numbers, kept an ear out for this distinction. A place that is executing will absorb the shock of a raid better than a place that improvises, because its human beings have not been trained to light themselves on fire to make a statistic look good. The Germans wanted to know whether Willow Run's people were being spent or being conserved. Finally, the object of the mission was political, in the small p sense that industrial facts do not stay in the plants that produce them. They travel to command rooms, to ministries, to maps on tables where men make promises to each other in hard voices. If the film and the counts and the notes came home with a sober verdict that the cadence would hold and might rise, then assumptions would have to change. Fighter development programs that banked on slowing the American tide would need new timetables. Ground defenses that assumed seasonal pauses would need to learn a new calendar. Negotiations inside the Reich about the allocation of scarce resources, steel and fuel and machine tools and transport would tilt. The mission was, in this way, an audit of optimism. Governments run on optimism the way factories run on oil. Optimism must be warranted or it gums up the bearings. It is easy to turn such intent into a drama of cat and mouse. That drama existed, to be sure, false identities, rented rooms, cold nights on fence lines, the sudden click of a camera when a guard glanced away. But the mind that grasps the stakes understands that the central character was never the spy and never the guard. The central character was the line, and the line does not notice the human plot that unwinds around it. It advances on rails of steel and habit, while men risk themselves to prove a point they hope is untrue. The observers were not hunting secrets hidden in a safe. They were hunting a pattern that refused to hide at all. Patterns do not fear cameras, they fear neglect. Willow Run did not neglect itself. That is what the film shows, and that is what the men who carried it home had to admit. Intent is often judged by outcomes in retrospect, so let the outcome illuminate the aim. The mission sought to discover whether American industry, having promised to turn the sky into a factory floor, had succeeded. The answer was yes in the way that breaks sophisticated hearts. Not yes as in perfection. Yes as in sufficiency multiplied by time. Yes as in adequate processes done nearly the same way, so many times that adequacy became a strategic weapon. Yes, as in replacing the poetry of individual genius with the prose of competent minutes. When the observers wrote their summaries, they did not need to lean on adjectives. They could tabulate. Tablature is the least flattering and most lethal way to tell such a story. There is a grace, even in defeat, in telling the truth cleanly. The men who brought the film back knew they would not be thanked for it, but they also knew that planning lives by the light of facts. They did their work with a heavy sort of pride. They had looked at a factory and let it speak for itself. They had watched a nation's will made mechanical. They had kept count, and when they set the canisters down on a desk and stepped back, they had delivered what they came for. The quiet sentence no commander wants to hear, but every commander should. The opponent has built a way to keep his promises. A wall is only as strong as the lives that must pass through it. The strange advantage and weakness of a factory like this is the number of necessary invitations it issues each day. Steel and rubber must arrive, coal must feed the boilers, food must find the workers, toolmakers and inspectors and truck drivers and janitors and nurses must turn up on time. Security designs a fortress, production designs a village. Between those designs lies the narrow space where a careful intruder can walk. The men who came to watch did not imagine a vault with a single keyhole. They imagined a place that functioned because thousands of keyholes stayed open, briefly and constantly, and they asked to be carried through one of them as if they belonged. They studied the edges first. You can learn much about a plant by keeping your feet out of it. The perimeter roads told them where the dusty shoulders were, the places where an idling car would be ignored because trucks idled there every day. The rail yard presented an even kinder theatre, because railroad work is both open and purposeful. People standing among cars and switches look right if they carry a clipboard and wrong only when they stare without writing. They did not stare. They wrote numbers of cars, initials on their sides, the cadence with which empties left and loads arrived. A rail yard is a barometer. The needle swings more honestly than any spokesman's mouth. Vendors gave them their second doorway. A large plant outsources not because it is lazy, but because it is wise. The wisdom creates a busy ecology of delivery men, calibration techs, oilers, scrap buyers, and equipment tuners who come and go without ceremony. The observers joined their shadows, learned the talk that does not raise eyebrows, wore boots that had walked in machine shops before. A gate guard cannot memorize every face in a city. He relies on the signs of belonging that the city itself produces. When a man knows the name of a foreman, the location of a side door, the contents of a crate without reading the stencil, he passes because he sounds like the day passing. At shift change, they watched the buses. Movement in bulk has a music of its own. If you can hum along, you can hide in the choir. There were mornings when a man stepped down onto the gravel and flowed with the group through the place where lunch pails knocked and banter carried. A visitor folded into that river becomes an unnamed drop. He knows where to pause because everyone pauses at the turnstiles. He knows where to look bored because boredom is the dominant emotion of admission when thousands must show the same pass. The trick is not stealth. The trick is patience and a body that carries the minor burdens of the tribe, a scuffed thermos, a rolled-up newspaper, a stain of oil on a cuff that says, "I have already done something on my way here." When an entrance from the outside felt unwise, they turned to height. Observation at altitude is not always exotic. It can be as simple as renting a room with a view where a planer's rasp carries through the open windows and the line of roofs resolves into a geometry. A camera on a tripod, lenses cleaned by the same routine 100 times, was introduced to the skyline at dawn and dusk. You do not need a tour to read the building's breath if you can see which stacks steam early and which lights burn late. You do not need a badge to understand the rhythm of a line if you can watch a convoy of sub-assemblies cross the same yard at the same minute 3 days running. What you lack in intimacy you gain in objectivity. The scene cannot flatter you when it does not know you are there. Sometimes the only honest method is the oldest walk up to the public face and ask for the most boring access you can imagine. People who ask for too little are often given more than they deserve. An intruder with a plausible business card requesting a 5-minute meeting to confirm a catalogue number for a replacement gauge may be escorted past the stations that matter, while a busy clerk apologizes for the wait. The camera remains in a pocket. The eyes do not. The mind replaces film with sequence. The sign that names an aisle, the board where defects are chalked. The voice that calls a part by a nickname old hands use because it saves a second. You exit with a smile and a sheaf of notes that look like invoices and are, to those who can read them, a kind of illuminated manuscript. The question of risk was never romantic. A badge check in a bad mood, a supervisor with a gift for faces, a guard who likes to make a man empty his pockets. These are not villains. They are the punctuation that any sentence of intrusion must survive. The visitors adjusted their grammar accordingly. They cut the number of attempts that had to succeed. They favored slow intelligence over a single spectacular haul. The nature of a flow line rewards that method. You do not need the one forbidden shot from the middle of the sacred station. You need 100 ordinary glimpses that add up to proof that the ordinary will continue. Inside any large plant, even one that has posted rules for every corridor, the greatest security is the work itself. The same momentum that pushes a fuselage toward daylight also pushes a puzzled stranger toward a door. If you stand still too long without a tool in your hand, you enter into dissonance with a place built entirely from verbs. The men who watched learned to keep moving with a purpose borrowed from others. They lifted a crate handle for a few steps, held a door for a woman steering a cart, asked a known-to-be busy man where the washroom was, and then followed the man's finger past the view they needed. The factory believed them because nobody with time to spare would behave like a worker who must beat the clock while keeping his fingers. Every success demanded its own kind of restraint. A photograph of a hoist in motion is more than a photograph of a hoist. It is a snapshot of the load a station can bear, the distance it travels, the clearance it keeps above the heads that walk beneath it. To a practiced eye, a blur of fixtures on a cart is not a blur at all. It is a catalogue entry in motion, a promise about interchangeability. But the camera will betray you if you become proud of it. The wisest theft is often a theft from your own appetite for precision. A blurred image that spares you an extra second on the floor is better than a crisp disaster that ends your work for good. They learned to accept the impressionistic when the impression already told the truth. When leaving, they always did so as if late for something else. An intruder who lingers at the edge of a completed act invites fate to invent a new scene. The road away from the plant is as much a part of entry as the gate, because a mind that cannot stop rehearsing the steps it has just completed loses the attention required to navigate the rest. They made their exit's ordinary lunch at a crowded diner, a stop at a hardware store to buy a screwdriver that would later scratch a serial number into metal, a return to the quiet room where notes became memory more durable than film. Security thinks of chains of custody and locks. The outsider thinks of chains of habit. Habit, rightly used, is a key that does not shine. Once the rhythms were known, entry became less a trick and more a vow. They did not celebrate each time the camera blinked. They merely added another beat to a song that had already told them how it ended. What made their method chilling to describe after the war was not its daring. It was its sanity. The plant could not help welcoming them in small, unknowing ways, because the same openness made it powerful. That is the secret of a nation at war with its whole self mobilized. The very scale that frightens the enemy makes the edges porous, and yet the scale also makes every brief intrusion dissolve into tides of motion that carry the day against any single act of malice. The visitors did not change the line by walking beside it. The line changed them because it taught them to count with its patience. When they left, they carried more than pictures. They carried the understanding that this was not a fortress to be breached, but a river to be outlasted, and that the river had no intention of running dry. Begin at the door where raw material enters and pretend the lens has no eyelids. Sheets of aluminum lean like bright flags against racks, each tagged with a code that binds it to a drawing and a tolerance. A crane dips, clamps, lifts. The sheets slide into presses whose dies kiss them into curves that will one day meet the wind. The press does not shout, it exhales authority. Each strike repeats a shape so exactly that the eye begins to trust the idea of identity, the possibility that the 10th and the 1000th panel will argue only about polish, not about truth. A cart arrives with ribs, a cart leaves with skins, and the station's clock resets for the next cycle. Downline, there is the architecture that turns parts into certainty. Jigs with locating pins, anvils and arbors. Templates that demand the same hole in the same place, at the same angle every time. The romance of craftsmanship would let a master judge by feel and pass on his instincts with stories. The camera records a different faith. It shows a fixture that instructs the novice's hands where they must go. You can read kindness in such steel. A well-made jig does not flatter the person using it. It forgives the newness that might otherwise lead to waste. The machine does not reduce the person. It reduces the number of failures the person must learn from. Hoists move without drama. The choice to lift rather than to muscle is both ergonomic and strategic. A worker who does not spend courage to fight gravity will have courage left for the 1,000 small judgments a day requires. Overhead motion tells you where planners valued repeatability more than bravado. It tells you that geometry has been domesticated. A spar hangs like a wide, patient bird until the station below decides it is time to marry it to its mate. Alignment is an act of mercy disguised as precision. The parts are urged into union by guide fingers that know the difference between almost and always. Kitting is a quiet revolution the camera adores because it looks like housekeeping and behaves like prophecy. A kit is a promise that all necessary parts will arrive together arranged in the order the hands will need them. Watch a cart roll in with bins nested like paragraphs. Fasteners in the exact count, seals coiled but not tight, brackets wrapped against scratches, a small card that speaks in symbols to both the new hire and the old. The kit is the opposite of a scavenger hunt. It is a denial of improvisation. If improvisation appears, the system has failed and says so with a light, a buzzer, or a chalk mark. The camera loves the chalk most, because it captures a human reaction to a non-human demand. Someone admits a miss by making it visible. The visible miss is the seed of tomorrow's improvement. Training rigs live off the main line the way practice fields live beside a stadium. They look like toys, like slices of the real stations, simplified and made safe for repetition. Here the novice learns to set a rivet until noise becomes rhythm and rhythm becomes feel that will not betray her when the airframe is real and the stakes cannot be hidden. A trainer watches without swagger. He has learned that confidence is not a speech but the absence of doubt at the moment the tool fires. The camera loves these places because they are the factory's conscience. They confess that competence is not born in a day, then manufacture it anyway by the oldest industrial magic. Repetition without shame. Quality control is not a policeman here. It is a partner. Gauges do the talking because numbers do not get tired. A fixture that closes only when the part's dimensions fall within the zone makes philosophy unnecessary. Either the latch drops or it does not. The lens lingers on hands that flip gauges with the speed of someone counting beads. Failure does not occasion anger, only an adjustment upstream and another try. In the way a person sets a part back on a bench, you see the ethic. To repair is not a mark against pride, it is the fulfillment of it. Somewhere a board counts hours without asking anyone to interpret them. Lights blink in rows that mean nothing to an outsider and everything to the person who must decide whether a pause is a hiccup or a harm. Information does not live in memos, it lives in standardized shapes and simple sounds. A white card slotted in green means kits are on time. A red diagonal slashed across a column means a supplier has slipped and the buffer is doing its duty while someone makes a call. The camera records not only motion, but the serenity born of knowing where to look when something is wrong. On days of stress, the line's defensive organs reveal themselves. A station that once ran flush pauses with dignity, while an alternate station a few steps away absorbs the delay. Somewhere a small team pulls from a cage of pre-built subassemblies meant for just such a moment. These are not miracles. They are the residue of imagination turned into hardware weeks earlier by people who assumed bad luck would visit and did not want to spend rage greeting it. The lens does not catch heroics in these seconds. It catches manners, respect for the schedule, respect for the worker, respect for the airplane that deserves not to carry anyone's panic into the sky. Near final assembly, the airplane becomes something the heart recognizes. Up close, it remains a swarm of details. Cables route along trays that refuse to let them chafe. Hydraulics find their fittings with the help of flares cut without burrs, because somewhere upstream a honing machine was maintained with the kind of affection that never makes the papers. The camera finds faces here, not because faces are more important than fixtures, but because faces at this stage reveal the quiet pride of a craft made non-mystical. Pride in a place like this is not loud. It is the way a person wipes a smudge from a panel no one will ever see because his name is not on the plane but his sense of self is. Across from the airplane, not far but a world away, a room holds broken parts and lessons. Each failed component tells a story that does not end with blame. A failed seal teaches a change of material. A cracked bracket teaches a revisit of radius. A scuffed wire teaches a different clamp. The camera visits this place briefly because it hurts to look at what could have been tragedy later. Yet this room explains why tragedy is rare. A factory that makes a home for its errors is one that will not be surprised by them, where surprise would be expensive. When the line delivers its work to the airfield fence, the machine of people closes its loop. A test pilot climbs a ladder and disappears toward the cockpit. Ground crews raise their hands for checks that began as signatures on the line. The lens pulls back as if embarrassed to intrude. It has lived among steel and oil all day and now meets the sky, which belongs to others. But before it leaves, it takes one more look over its shoulder at the floor. The stations have already reset. Kitted carts have arrived. Empty racks wait to be filled. The hoists are patient again. The system is not tired of itself. That may be the deepest thing a camera can capture, because fatigue ruins truth faster than lies. The place has built an immunity to weariness by teaching everyone to do hard things the same way, with the same respect for what must be repeated. The recording ends not with fanfare but with a quiet conviction that tomorrow has already been scheduled and accepted by everyone who matters. A nation that fights with factories chooses an arithmetic of mercy for its crews and an arithmetic of menace for its enemies. The mercy is hidden in the fact that fewer crews must fly tired airplanes when fresh ones arrive on time. The menace lies in the way production converts ambition into feasibility. 1 airplane is a symbol, 10 are a nuisance. 100 per month becomes a policy. Scale forces strategy to straighten itself. Plans written in fog grow sharp when a steady river of machines will back them. Begin with sorties, because air power is not a count of aircraft so much as a count of missions flown and sustained. Every airplane that rolls from a line becomes a certain number of sorties not yet flown but made possible. The multiplier is not poetic. It depends on maintenance hours between flights, on the availability of parts, on trained ground crews who know what the airplane expects of them when it coughs or when it sings. A factory that standardizes assembly standardizes the life of the machine after acceptance. Manuals begin to tell the truth more often than they lie. Mechanics who have never met can open panels in the same order and find the same fastener head waiting in the same corner. That sameness is a strange kind of kindness to men who will work in cold and dark. It is also an invisible weapon. A squadron that needs fewer clever fixes can fly more often than a squadron that lives on cleverness. Cleverness, like courage, is a scarce resource. Scale lets you save it for the day that demands magic. Attrition writes its own impartial history in the sky. Machines age, engines cough, ailerons bite, flak gropes upward in black flowers that have no politics. The question the camera's owners needed to answer for their superiors was whether the rate at which the sky erased airplanes could be outpaced by the rate at which the ground drew them into being. When you tie factory cadence to operational demands, you discover whether a plan deserves to live. If losses of a given kind average so many per month, and the plant can replace that count with a predictable margin above it, then a commander can plan offensives without bargaining with fate. If the plant lags, plans shrink in the drawer and men are asked to make up the difference with valor. Valor does not scale. Willow Run's discipline turned menace into math that could be relied upon, and menace that can be relied upon quietly dictates terms. Spare parts behave like another air force that never flies. They sit in crates in depots and on trucks crossing oceans and on shelves near windy airfields, and their mere existence changes behavior. A crew that trusts a supply chain does not nurse an ailing engine past reason. It writes it up and takes another airplane because the system has promised not to make that choice feel like cowardice. A maintenance chief who knows a new pump will arrive by the 3rd day does not cannibalize a healthy machine to keep a sick one going. Cannibalization is a word with teeth. It eats readiness even when it saves a sortie. Scale defeats cannibalization by making patience affordable. Patience in war is far more aggressive than it sounds. There is a psychological advantage that cannot be graphed easily and yet saturates every decision. Opponents learn, slowly at first and then catastrophically, that the factory has replaced the battlefield as the center of gravity. A protected line becomes a shield for 1,000 types of bravery. Crews take risks because they have a chance to fly new airplanes if the old ones die. Planners widen aims because they do not fear the fragility of their tools. Intelligence analysts, on the other side, file reports that feel like weather forecasts. The storm continues. The front advances. There is no break in sight. Policymakers who once imagined a counterstroke in the realm of invention start to bargain with realities in the realm of production. When invention cannot be generalized into reliable output, it retreats into myth. When production can be trusted to feed invention, invention becomes law. The flow from plant to port to field builds its own culture. Ships load with components sorted to keep units flying on arrival. Railroads in friendly lands learn to prioritize the car that carries what a depot needs over the car that merely clears a backlog. Road nets acquire habits that make convoys less vulnerable and more punctual. Each improvement seems trivial in isolation, Together they act like a second army that does not wear uniforms. 2. An enemy watching from the outside. This second army is the real opponent. Air battles become symptoms of deeper conflicts measured in man-hours and tons moved without incident. None of this requires perfection. The myth that only a flawless machine of state can deliver decisive advantage is consoling to the side that stumbles. The reality is harsher and kinder. Sufficiency repeated can beat excellence that arrives fitfully. The line that turns out dependable airplanes at a steady cadence enables 1,000 ordinary acts to add up to something extraordinary. A single brilliant aircraft that proves its concept on Tuesday will not change a campaign if its parts are rare and its maintenance mystical. A good aircraft that can be fixed by a tired crew in the rain using parts on hand will. The camera that watched Willow run recorded, unintentionally, a philosophy of adequacy raised to the level of art. When industry reaches this pitch, strategy must bend around it the way wind bends around a mountain. An opponent may try to bomb the mountain. He may throw saboteurs at its base and whisper fear into the villages at its feet. But the mountain is the fact that refuses to leave. An economy that has taught itself to do one right thing many times is not a list of factories. It is a habit lodged in millions of hours. The adversary who misunderstands this will chase headlines while the other side quietly accumulates inevitability. The last portion of the equation sits where steel meets will. Machines exist so that human beings can decide how to use their courage. When supply is sure, courage is not squandered staving off collapse. It is aimed at the point of decision. The men who reviewed the film understood this in their bones. They had wanted to report that America's loud promises were theatre. Instead, they were forced to describe a stage on which the props themselves made performances more likely to end well. A plant is not a soldier. It cannot climb a ladder into a cockpit or hold formation in hail. Yet in the sum of months, a plant can act more like a soldier than a man can stand to admit. It takes orders from the calendar and obeys them, and in obeying them it writes the outlines of future maps. There is no single trumpet that announces inevitability. It arrives as a series of small humiliations, each one survivable, none loud enough to excuse panic. The men who carried cameras and notebooks felt it as a change in their own vocabulary. They stopped reaching for adjectives and began to rely on verbs. The line moves, kits arrive, hoists lift, gauges close, the pilot signs. They discovered that narrative had been replaced by procedure. When a story deprives you of drama and still advances, you are standing inside a machine that has found its purpose. One memory took hold and would not leave. A young woman at a station no one advertised had a job that seemed beneath notice. Set a seal, confirm the fit with a glance honed by an afternoon of training, reach for the next seal laid out in order by someone she had never met. The camera followed the motion twice, then 3 times, then 30. Her hands never hurried. A supervisor drifted past and never needed to say a word because the design of the work spoke for him. In that simple scene, the visitors heard the sound a factory makes when it has ceased to be fragile. It is the sound of a person not having to be a hero to be valuable. Another moment came on a day of rain when the yard turned slick and the shoulders of the road held water enough to make rats reconsider their holes. A convoy of sub-assemblies crossed under the gloom on skates of steel. The hoists dripped, and the workers dripped, and the camera lens had to be wiped more than once, and yet nothing faltered in the procession. The sight was unglamorous and undeniable. The line did not ask the weather for permission to keep its appointments. A system that operates in ugly weather as if weather were a rumor does not promise glory. It promises to exhaust you if you stand against it. They had expected to find a place where old crafts had been pressed into service against their will. What they found instead was a place that had been designed from its footings to prefer repetition over virtuosity. The revelation soured in the mind because it left no gap for sabotage to find leverage. Sabotage thrives on exceptions, and exceptions had been coerced into the margins. If a station stalled, a buffer caught the fall. If a tool failed, another hung within reach, and the station captain did not have to improvise with a hammer and self-regard. Each of these small architectural decisions added up to a building that could ignore misfortune long enough to keep its commitments. You cannot frighten such a building. You can only break it outright, and breaking it outright would require resources the enemy now needed elsewhere. The realization also entered through the ear. There are factories where managers live in the mode of alarm. You can hear it in clipped commands, in scolded pauses, in the way footsteps speed up as the day bleeds away. This place sounded different, a hum that had learned its own tone, a rhythm that refused to spike and crash. Voices rose when they needed to, and fell when they should. The absence of panic, in warfare, is as terrifying as defiance. It tells you that the other side has found a way to make its fear useful without tasting it constantly. That is a kind of stoicism no training can give a person, only a system can lend it to them. Above all, the recognition arrived with time's signature. The visitors had been diligent. They had counted on a bad day arriving to save their thesis. Bad days came, but they did not behave like omens. They behaved like weather. A supplier slipped and the buffer drew down, then refilled with no need for confessional speeches. A crane stopped, and a second crane, smaller but well placed, turned a delay into an inconvenience, measured in minutes rather than hours. A run of parts that should have fit did not, and the error became a detour to the room where the cause would be diagnosed and a corrective sent upstream with a deadline attached. Most organizations write epic memos about such days. This one filled out forms so banal that the pen marks looked bored. The boredom was not apathy, it was competence under load. When they met in secret to lay their notes out on hotel blankets and rented tables, the men found that they had little to argue about and much to dread. The map they drew with pencils and bottle caps and matchboxes stood independent of their hopes. A schedule had become a shape in space, and that shape enclosed a volume of certainty large enough to shelter the messy human parts of war. The first of them said it plainly, and hated himself for the calm in his own voice. The other side has solved the problem of tomorrow. Once you solve the problem of tomorrow, you begin to starve an enemy who planned to live on your mistakes. The admission they carried home was not an orator's flourish. It did not volunteer conclusions about nations and character. It did not posture. It simply compared two slopes. On one slope were losses, delays, shortages, the innumerable frictions that turn boldness into a bruise. On the other slope was an upward line drawn by fixtures and timetables and hands that had been relieved of the burden of genius so that their steadiness could matter. The two slopes intersected in the future, and after that point the curve of production rose above the curve of attrition far enough to dictate how campaigns would be imagined. The men did not have to predict everything to know the difference between a summer war and a winter war. They had seen a furnace being fed by a train that would not stop. The unpleasant splinter in the mind after such recognition is the knowledge that you are witnessing an opponent's kindness to his own people. That is not a sentiment to bring home to a regime that equates kindness with softness, but the evidence was blunt. The system spared its workers unnecessary exertion by designing tasks that resisted error. It spared its crews at the front unnecessary dread by delivering machines that behaved consistently and could be maintained by mortals. It spared its commanders unnecessary bargaining with luck by replacing empty promises with full calendars. That sort of kindness hardens a society instead of weakening it. It keeps courage in reserve for the hour when courage belongs on the line of battle, not on the line in a factory. In the last frame they developed from that season, a finished machine sat nose to the fence while a small, mundane ritual played out. A mechanic crouched to check a panel latch. A woman lifted her child so he could see over the barrier. A guard raised his palm for a truck and then waved it through when the driver grinned and shouted that he was already late for the next gate. The airplane itself was almost a background. The foreground belonged to a population that had made building it ordinary. The ordinariness was the revelation. An extraordinary nation would have been easier to discount. Exceptions, even brilliant ones, can be contained. Ordinariness that produces power is an argument you cannot answer with rhetoric or raids. It is a daily vote cast by a million small motions. The Spies wrote that sentence with as few adjectives as they could manage. Then they put down their pens and waited for the sound a man makes when he accepts that the thing he fears will continue tomorrow at the same hour, whether or not he admits it aloud. The rumours clung to the war like burrs to a coat, spread by letters home and by men who wanted to sound worldly in smoky rooms. A bomber, an hour, someone would say, and the table would laugh as if at a bar trick. The truth was both plainer and more formidable. There were days when the cadence hit a pace that, seen from a distance, looked like a clock striking on the hour. There were other days when weather pressed on deliveries or a stubborn jig demanded attention and the count fell short. What mattered was not the boast but the slope. The plant learned how to protect its average, and averages determine campaigns. Reality was not a perfect parade. It was a patient march that never forgot the way forward. Another favourite tale held that sheer numbers were a simple matter of throwing bodies at bolts. Anyone who has stood under a hoist for 10 minutes knows this is false. Bodies without fixtures make a mess. Fixtures without scheduling make a museum. The method was the secret, and method is not glamorous. It is labels that never lie. Carts that arrive with parts in the order hands require. Gauges that refuse to close on anything out of tolerance. The visitors wanted drama and discovered domesticity. Nothing is so dangerous as an opponent who has domesticated complexity and made it obedient. A darker whisper insisted that the film in hand must have exaggerated the smoothness of the day. Yet the camera had no reason to flatter. It captured pauses, spills, slips, the small embarrassments that occur when men and women hurry to meet the hour. The difference was what happened next. Pauses did not metastasize. Spills were absorbed by buffers planned by someone who had imagined the worst in the calm of last month. Slips were recorded in chalk, not as shame, but as raw material for tomorrow's adjustment. Reality proved less theatrical than rumour and far more relentless. There was also the old insult that quantity dulls quality. The finished machines provided the reply every time a test pilot signed a line and took off. Standardization in the build made standardization in the behavior, and standardization allowed mechanics at cold airfields to find problems quickly. A squadron that knows its airplanes will not surprise. It can use aggression for tactics rather than maintenance. The rumor wanted to believe that mass production meant careless sameness. The reality was careful sameness, and careful sameness is what makes thousands of miles and months of weather survivable. The last rumor tried to console the anxious with the idea that imagination would defeat routine, that some brilliant counter would shatter the rhythm. Perhaps once, in a skirmish of ideas. But strategy is an appetite that must be fed daily. Routine is a kitchen. Once it is stocked and staffed, brilliance without breakfast grows thin. The reality that seeped into the mind, hour after hour, was that no single gesture could unmake a schedule that had learned to keep its own promises. Rumor offers a shortcut to comfort. Reality prefers the long road, and by the time the rumor tires, reality has already arrived. A system that matters must answer 3 quiet questions. Who keeps the numbers? Who checks the numbers? Who changes the numbers when the world shifts? The first answer lived in ledgers that did not brag. Stations closed their days with marks that aligned with kits pulled and assemblies advanced. Dispatch kept a trail that could be walked backward from a finished airframe to the morning it first met a jig. The paper did not glow, yet it glowed with authority because it reconciled with the floor. An entry that could not be found with boots was corrected with ink. That discipline made auditors possible and propaganda unnecessary. Checking belonged to people who did not have time for theatre. Inspectors walked the line with gauges and forms meant to leave little room for interpretation. They did not punish error with raised voices. They punished it with rework and with upstream changes that prevented repetition. Outside the building, government readers with calm eyes connected plant claims to acceptance flights and to the arrival of machines where they were needed. No one wanted surprises. In a war, surprises belong to the enemy. The records existed to make sure that surprises stayed rare even when weather misbehaved or a supplier faltered. The habit of being believed is earned. Willow Run earned it with paperwork that always found its parent on the floor. Change was governed with the same stern humility. When a seal cracked, engineers amended drawings and the kit card changed so a worker's hand would reach for a better thing without needing a speech. When a supplier missed a date, the schedule flexed by design rather than convulsion. When a jig taught an unintended lesson, a modification appeared in steel rather than in a memo. Decisions migrated toward the places where evidence lived. That is how a large system stays gentle with its people, while firm with its purpose. The distant offices received reports that did not flatter and did not panic. They approved what was already working and demanded to see, not hear, what would fix what was not. Knowing, in such a setting, is not a matter of personality, it is a matter of custody. Numbers move from one desk to another and can be traced by anyone with reason to care. The men who would later read captured documents noticed that the trail from kit to airplane and from airplane to squadron survived the months intact. That is rare. Paper dies in disorganized places. Here the paper had a life because it introduced itself every morning in the form of parts arriving, tools calibrated, and people assigned to work that matched their skill. The philosophy behind the filing cabinet was the same as the philosophy behind the line. Make things findable. Make them equal to yesterday. Make tomorrow a repetition with improvements. This is why the claims about output, once doubted, became tedious in their truth. When a plant can show how it knows, skepticism becomes a preference rather than a position. The answer to disbelief is never a louder voice. It is a walk with a pencil that draws a straight line from a number on a form to a machine in sunlight. That line existed in this place, and those who wished it did not have to settle for hoping the weather would change. Weather passes, a habit that has convinced itself to write everything down and to mean it will outlast a storm. They assembled in a room that smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool. Film cans sweated on the table. Notes lay in stacks secured by string. Each man had rehearsed a version of the truth on the way there, and now disliked how simple it sounded when spoken. The message was not eloquent, it was arithmetic. The plant had achieved a cadence that accidents could bruise but not break. Training systems turned strangers into contributors faster than sabotage could make dents. Logistics fed the line with a patience that suggested the map itself had been taught to cooperate. They described what the lens had loved and what the mind feared. Fixtures did the work of teachers. Jigs eliminated arguments. Hoists preserved shoulders and kept judgment fresh. Kits arrived as promises fulfilled, and when a promise failed, the failure exposed itself in a place built to fix it in hours rather than in weeks. There were no heroes in the frames and no need for them. The report insisted on that point because it mattered to strategy. An opponent who can dispense with heroes in his factories will have heroes to spare where guns speak. The men hated the elegance of that sentence and could not avoid it. The hardest paragraphs concerned inevitability. Commanders prefer options. Options feel like power. The report admitted that options were shrinking. You could bomb the plant, yes, and you might damage buildings and people and pride. But the culture of repetition would survive in drawings and in habits, and the network that carried parts would find detours while the walls rose again. You could innovate a counter and hope it made the old airplanes obsolete. Yet the enemy's method made adopting improvements faster than hope could justify. You could promise a decisive move if only the storm of machines abated. The storm, the report said without metaphors, would not abate. They tried to be generous to their own side. They noted where the line still knocked its knuckles against reality. Buffers sometimes ran thin when a remote mill fell behind. A stretch of the conveyor asked for too much of the clock and would demand redesign. Supervisors varied in kindness and in clarity. None of this altered the thrust. The system had taught itself to notice flaws and to convert them into work orders rather than excuses. That reflex makes a place immune to despair. It is despair, not bombs, that most efficiently halts a program. In the end, the language grew spare, almost legal. Production has exceeded the rate necessary to replace observed losses in theatre. Maintenance behavior downstream shows effects of standardization sufficient to project increased sortie rates. Scheduling demonstrates resilience under disruption, at levels consistent with sustained operations. They signed their names under statements that had no room for rhetoric. The men in higher rooms read without blinking, then blinked, and asked the only honest question left. How long? Long enough, came the answer, delivered with the fatigue of witnesses who would rather have been wrong. What the lens began and the ledgers confirmed ends here with a plain conclusion. A society that writes its will into fixtures and timetables has discovered a form of strength that does not tire at night. The plant by the fields turned repetition into a kind of courage. Parts arrived, hands learned, gauges closed, airplanes rolled, and the days accepted the sameness without resentment. The enemy wanted to believe that such sameness was dull. Dullness, harnessed, is a blade. It cuts through doubt and through distance and through the pleasant myths by which a weaker logistics chain consoles itself. To call the outcome inevitable is not to reduce the valor of those who flew or fought. It is to honor the decision to conserve valor for the right hour. The line did not empty the sky of risk. It filled the calendar with certainty. Certainty is the rarest of rations in war. Commanders who possess it ration blood more wisely. Crews who trust the pipeline focus their bravery where it matters most and refuse to squander it on the repair of preventable neglect. The contest that began with inventions ended with provisions. The nation that could provide at scale taught the terms of victory to everyone else. There is a final image that belongs at the close. It is not an airplane climbing or a politician speaking. It is the inside of a quiet storeroom at dusk. Bins labelled in a hand so consistent it looks printed, shadows neat on the floor, the air smelling of oil and cardboard. A clerk checks a count and closes a ledger. Nothing about the scene announces triumph. Yet from such rooms radiate the promises that let machines fly again tomorrow, and from such promises flow the confidence that lets a strategy reach beyond a single season. The camera might have found this dull and passed on. It should not have. The war's hinge lives in rooms like this, tended by people who think in dates and parts, and who treat accuracy as if it were kindness. When the men who watched returned to their own country with their film, they did not bring back a surprise. They brought back a schedule that was not theirs to change. They had hoped for a spectacle to unmask and found a discipline to endure. That is the quiet cost of acknowledging an opponent who has turned industry into a doctrine. You do not measure him by speeches. You measure him by the number of times his workers repeat a motion correctly before lunch, by the number of kits that arrive exactly when a hand reaches for them, by the number of evenings a test pilot signs his name without flinching. Add those numbers across the months and you have a verdict. The verdict is not poetry. It is a date after which defeat moves from possibility to probability, and from probability to a future so heavy that even the hopeful grow still. The plant did not promise to win alone. It promised to deny the other side the luxury of believing that time would rescue them. Time had been conscripted. It wore a badge. It punched a clock. It went home tired and came back ready. And when the sky over distant fields grumbled with engines that sounded alike, the echo that followed was the hum of a line that had learned to keep its word.